Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to wander away from the royal courts and the inbred dukes for a bit. Instead, we're heading into the high, silent peaks of the Rockies in the 1820s. We're talking about the mountain men, those rugged, solitary, and occasionally very smelly individuals who decided that society was a bit much and that living in a sub-zero wilderness with a bunch of beaver traps was a much better career path. Because honestly, why deal with taxes when you can deal with grizzly bears and frostbite? It's a vibe. A very cold, very damp vibe. Now, we think we understand the cold. We have central heating and we have those fancy heated seats in our cars. But the mountain men understood cold on a molecular level. They understood that the cold isn't just a temperature, it's a persistent enemy that's trying to invite itself into your bones. And tonight, we're going to look at exactly how they stayed alive when the world around them was trying to turn them into human popsicles. The myth of the heavy coat. We usually start our winter prep by buying the thickest, puffiest jacket we can find. But if you showed a modern puffer jacket to someone like Jedediah Smith or Jim Bridger, they'd probably just blink at you with a mix of confusion and pity. Because the first thing a mountain man understood about the cold was that sweat is actually your greatest enemy. If you're wearing a massive, non-breathable coat while trekking through 3 feet of snow, you're going to sweat. And in the mountains, sweat is just a fancy word for pre-ice. Once you stop moving, that moisture cools down, and suddenly you're wearing a refrigerator. The mountain men preferred buckskin and wool. Buckskin was great because it was tough, but it had a nasty habit of turning into cardboard when it got wet. So the real secret was the layering and the grease. Yes, they were very greasy. They would rub animal fat into their clothes and sometimes their skin. It smelled terrible, obviously, but it created a waterproof barrier. It's hard for the wind to bite through a layer of literal bear fat. It's not a fashion statement I'd recommend for a first date, but when it's 30 below, you stop caring about your scent profile and start caring about your toes. The architecture of the lean-to. Let's float over to the sleeping arrangements, which were, to put it mildly, minimalist. They didn't have tents. Tents are heavy, and when you're hauling your entire life on a pack horse, weight is everything. Instead, they used the half-faced camp, or a simple lean-to. Imagine a slanted roof made of pine boughs and bark leaning against a fallen log. That's it. That's the whole house. But the genius wasn't the roof, it was the fire. They understood the physics of radiant heat way better than we do. They would build a fire in front of the lean-to and then build a reflector wall of green logs or rocks behind the fire. The heat would hit the wall, bounce back into the lean-to, and wrap around them like a warm hug. It's basically a low-tech microwave. They'd wrap themselves in a heavy buffalo robe, which is essentially a 5-inch thick carpet made of fur, and sleep on a bed of pine needles. It's surprisingly cozy, provided you don't mind the occasional spark landing on your nose, or the very real possibility of a wolf checking in on your progress. The internal furnace. Then there's the food. We've been told that a balanced diet is important, but for a mountain man in January, a balanced diet was basically just a massive pile of fat. They didn't want salad. They wanted boudin, the fatty intestinal trimmings of a buffalo, roasted over a fire until they were sizzling. They understood that your body is a furnace. If you don't give the furnace enough fuel, the fire goes out. They would consume thousands and thousands of calories of pure animal fat. It kept their metabolism running high enough to generate internal heat. It's the reason they could wade through icy streams to check beaver traps and not immediately die of hypothermia. They were fueled by pure, unadulterated lipids and sheer stubbornness. because why have a six-pack when you can have a layer of insulation that actually keeps you alive? The psychology of the shiver. But maybe the most important thing they understood was the mental game. They didn't fight the cold, they lived in it. There's a certain stoicism that comes from knowing you're probably not going to be truly warm again until May. They had this casual, almost snarky relationship with discomfort. They'd sit around a campfire, snow piling up on their hats, and tell tall tales. They'd talk about petrified forests, where the birds sang petrified songs, just to keep their minds off the fact that their moccasins were frozen to their feet. It was a way of distancing themselves from the physical reality. If you can joke about the cold, it loses its power over you. We've forgotten that. We see a drop in temperature as a crisis. They saw it as Tuesday. They understood that the human body is remarkably good at enduring misery if the mind refuses to acknowledge it as such. It's a dark, quiet kind of strength. The gentle fade. So, as you're lying there in your warm bed, just think about those silent, snowy valleys. Think about the way the wind whistles through the lodgepole pines and the way a single small fire can hold back the entire weight of a mountain winter. The mountain men are gone now, but the mountains are still there, and the cold is still there, waiting. But you're safe. You're warm. You don't have to rub bare fat on your socks. You can just let go. Listen to the rhythm of the winter wind in your mind and let it carry you off into a deep, dreamless sleep. The beaver traps are set, the fire is reflecting off the rocks, the buffalo robe is heavy and warm. There's nothing left to do but rest. The architecture of survival. Now that we've established that the mountain man was essentially a very greasy, very stubborn human radiator, we should probably look at how they actually spent their days, because it wasn't all just sitting by a fire and contemplating the irony of their existence. Most of it was a slow, methodical dance with death. Specifically, the kind of death that comes when you stop paying attention to the physics of water. The science of the moccasin. Let's talk about feet. In the modern world, we have Gore-Tex and insulated hiking boots that cost more than a month's rent. The mountain man had the moccasin. Now, on the surface, a thin piece of deer hide seems like a terrible choice for the subarctic temperatures of a Wyoming winter, and you'd be right. If you just wear one pair of moccasins, you're going to lose your toes by Tuesday. But they didn't just wear one pair. They understood the concept of dead air space. They would wrap their feet in duffel, which was just thick scraps of wool, and then slide them into oversized moccasins stuffed with dry grass or buffalo hair. The grass acted as a natural insulator and a moisture wick. When the grass got damp from the sweat we talked about earlier, they'd just pull it out, throw it away, and stuff in some fresh, dry grass. It was a modular, disposable insulation system. It's actually more efficient than a modern boot, because once a modern boot gets wet on the inside, it stays wet. The mountain man's grass boots were always dry, provided they could find a patch of dead wild rye under the snow. It's a bit like wearing a nest on each foot, which sounds ridiculous until you realize it's the only reason they still had 10 toes at the end of the season. The icy bath. Let's float over to the beaver dams. This is where the mountain man's life got truly absurd. To catch a beaver, you have to go where the beaver is, and in the winter, the beaver is under the ice. This meant these men spent a significant portion of their lives wading hip-deep into slush-filled streams. Now, if you or I fell into a frozen creek today, we'd call an ambulance and probably get a very expensive hospital bill. The mountain man would just climb out, beat the slush off his buckskins, and keep moving. They understood that as long as they kept moving, their body heat would keep the water from freezing solid against their skin. The real danger was the after-chill. Once they were out of the water, they would immediately start a small, intense fire, often using fat wood or pine knots that are naturally soaked in flammable resin. They would stand as close to the flames as possible, literally steaming themselves dry.
It was a cycle of freezing and thawing that would probably destroy a modern person's nervous system, but for them, it was just the cost of doing business, because apparently a beaver pelt was worth more than physical comfort. To each their own, I suppose. The winter hole. Sometimes the mountains would throw a storm at them that made a lean-to look like a death trap. When a true nor'easter or a high-altitude blizzard hit, the mountain men borrowed a trick from the very animals they were hunting. They went underground, or rather under snow. They understood that snow is one of nature's best insulators. It's full of trapped air. If the wind was howling at 80 miles per hour and the temperature dropped to -40 degrees with a wind chill, they would dig a snow hole or a snow trench. By burrowing into a deep drift, they could get out of the wind entirely. Inside a snow cave, the temperature usually hovers right around freezing, 32 degrees. Now, 32 degrees is cold, but compared to -40 with a wind chill, it feels like a tropical resort. They would crawl in with their buffalo robes, light a single small candle or a tiny tallow lamp, and just wait. Sometimes they'd be trapped in there for days, listening to the muffled roar of the wind above them. It's a very specific kind of sensory deprivation, just the sound of your own breathing and the faint smell of wet fur. It's the ultimate do not disturb mode. If you're looking for a way to escape your emails, I highly recommend a snowdrift in the Uinta Mountains, though the Wi-Fi is notoriously spotty. The liquid gold, pine tea. Of course, staying warm isn't just about the outside, it's about the inside. We mentioned the buffalo fat, but they also needed vitamins, specifically vitamin C, to prevent scurvy, a delightful condition where your old wounds reopen and your teeth fall out. Not a great look for the annual rendezvous party. They couldn't exactly nip out for an orange in 1826. Instead, they watched what the local indigenous tribes did. They took the needles from white pine or hemlock trees and boiled them into a tea. It tasted, quite predictably, like floor cleaner, but it was packed with vitamin C, and more importantly, it was hot. Drinking a quart of boiling pine tea does two things. It tricks your stomach into thinking you've had a meal, and it raises your core temperature from the inside out. It's like a warm hug for your internal organs, even if your taste buds are screaming in protest. It's all about priorities. Do you want to taste something delicious, or do you want your skin to stay attached to your face? The mountain man chose the latter, albeit reluctantly. The mountain is getting darker now. The snow is falling in those big, heavy flakes that move so slowly, they almost look like they're drifting upward. The wind has died down to a whisper, and the only thing you can hear is the occasional crack of a freezing tree limb in the distance. You're wrapped in that heavy robe. The fire is just a glowing bed of coals, casting long, lazy shadows against the walls of your shelter. You're perfectly insulated. The cold is out there, but it can't get in. You've mastered the physics of the frost.
The great silence and the psychology of solitude. Now that your feet are wrapped in grass and your stomach is full of pine-flavored floor cleaner, we have to talk about the part of survival that people usually gloss over in the history books. We've covered the physical stuff, the fat, the fire, the snow holes, but we haven't talked about what happens to a human brain when it's trapped in a whiteout for 3 weeks with nothing to talk to but a pack horse named Barnaby. The mountain men lived in what they called the Great Silence. If you've ever been in a forest after a heavy snowfall, you know that sound, or rather the lack of it. Snow is a perfect acoustic insulator. It swallows sound. In the high Rockies, this silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a physical weight. And if you weren't careful, that weight could start to crush your sanity just as effectively as a grizzly bear could crush your ribs. The cabin fever of the mind. You see, humans are social creatures, even the ones who claim to hate everyone. But the mountain man was a specialist in isolation. During the peak of winter, when the passes were blocked and the beaver were tucked away in their lodges, these men would often be stuck in a tiny cabin or a dugout for months. They didn't have podcasts, they didn't have books, mostly because books are heavy, and many of these guys viewed literacy as an optional hobby.
So they had to invent ways to keep the mountain madness at bay. Some men would talk to their traps. Others would hold elaborate multi-day debates with their dogs. There are accounts of trappers who would host dinner parties for imaginary guests, complete with different voices for each character. It sounds crazy to us, but it was actually a sophisticated survival mechanism. It was a way to keep the language centers of the brain from atrophying. If you stop using your voice, you start to lose your grip on the reality of being human. They were essentially LARPing as socialites in a room that smelled like wet leather and old grease. You have to respect the hustle. The irony of the rendezvous mindset. The only thing that kept them going through the dark, silent months was the thought of the rendezvous. This was the massive summer gathering where they'd sell their furs, buy overpriced whiskey, and generally behave like they'd never seen another human being in their entire lives, which, to be fair, they hadn't. The mountain man survived the winter by living in the future. They practiced a form of mental time travel. When the wind was screaming outside and the food was running low, they weren't thinking about the cold. They were thinking about the taste of that first drop of grain alcohol in July. They were thinking about the sound of a fiddle. They understood something we often forget, that hope is a biological necessity. In a survival situation, the moment you stop imagining a future where you're warm and happy is the moment your body starts to give up. They were experts at delusion as a tool. They would sit in a dark hole and visualize the sun until their brains actually started to believe they were warmer than they were. It's a bit like gaslighting yourself, but for the noble purpose of not dying. The zen of the trap line. There's also something to be said for the flow state they achieved. When you're living that close to the edge, your focus becomes incredibly sharp. You aren't worrying about your 401k or that awkward thing you said in 2014. You are worrying about the exact tension of a spring and the subtle change in the scent of the air that means a storm is 12 hours away. This hyper-focus is actually very relaxing for the brain in a weird, stressful way. It strips away all the junk. The mountain men were often described as being slow of speech and having eyes that looked through you. They had reached a level of zen that only comes when you spent 6 months listening to nothing but the wind. They had a stillness in them. They had become part of the landscape, just another predator in a world of predators, moved by the same rhythms as the wolves and the elk. The comfort of the dark. As we sit here in the modern world, we're terrified of the dark and the quiet. We fill every second with noise and light. But the mountain man understood that the dark is where the rest happens. In those long winter nights, when the sun set at 4 p.m. and didn't come back until 8 a.m., they learned to sleep in a way we can't even imagine. They didn't just sleep, they hibernated. They'd sink into the buffalo robes, their heart rate slowing, their breath sinking with the rhythm of the mountain. They were safe in the great silence. So, as the silence of the night settles around you, try to see it not as a void, but as a blanket. It's the same silence that sat outside Jim Bridger's cabin in 1830. It's old, it's deep, and it's very, very patient. You don't need to fight it. You don't need to fill it with thoughts. You can just sink into it. The fire is a tiny orange eye in the vast blue-black night. The stars above the peaks are so bright that they look like they're vibrating. And you are here, tucked away, completely forgotten by the rest of the world. And honestly, that's the best feeling there is.
The gastronomy of desperation. Now, we've talked about the fat and the boudin and the floor cleaner tea. But what happens when the buffalo aren't there? What happens when the elk have moved to a different valley and the beaver are locked under 3 feet of impenetrable ice? This is where we move from the uncomfortable part of the story into the genuinely absurd survival tactics of the 1830s. Because let's be honest, the mountain man was essentially a professional eater who occasionally trapped things. Their entire life was a search for calories, and when the calories stopped showing up,
they had to get creative. And by creative, I mean they had to look at things that were definitely not food and convince themselves otherwise. The leather buffet. Let's talk about parched leather. It sounds like a bad indie band name, but for a starving trapper in the middle of a January blizzard, it was Sunday brunch. If things got truly dire, they would start looking at their own gear. They would take their extra moccasins or a spare piece of buffalo rawhide, and they would boil it and boil it and boil it some more. They would boil it until the collagen began to break down into a sort of gelatinous, flavorless glue. It had the nutritional value of a damp cardboard box, but it fooled the stomach into thinking something was happening down there. Imagine sitting in a dark cabin, chewing on a piece of your own footwear for 6 hours just to keep your jaw muscles from forgetting how to work. It's the ultimate irony. You're wearing your last meal. Of course, they'd joke about it. They'd argue over which brand of moccasin tasted better, or whether a bit of old saddle skirting had a nutty finish. Because if you don't laugh while you're eating your shoes, you've already lost. The inner bark and the bone marrow. When the shoes were gone, they turned to the trees. They understood that the inner cambium layer of certain trees, like the cottonwood or the pine, contains just enough sugar and starch to keep a human heart beating for another day. They would peel back the rough outer bark and scrape away the sweet, sticky layer underneath. It's basically tree-flavored taffy. It's incredibly bitter, and it probably does things to your digestion that I won't describe in a relaxation video, but it worked. And then there were the bone caches. If they were lucky enough to find the site of an old wolf kill, they wouldn't look for meat. That was long gone. They looked for the bones. They would smash the heavy thigh bones of an elk with a rock and suck out the marrow. Marrow is pure, concentrated fat and minerals. To a starving mountain man, a frozen elk bone was essentially a stick of butter wrapped in a rock. They'd sit there in the snow, cracking bones like macabre nutcrackers, getting every last milligram of energy out of a carcass that had been dead for months. The psychology of the hunger. There is a specific state of mind that comes with long-term starvation. Your world shrinks. You don't dream about glory or gold or even women. You dream about bread. You dream of the smell of a roasting haunch of meat. The mountain men called it the hunger with a capital H. But even then, they maintained that weird, snarky detachment. There's a story about a group of trappers who were so hungry they were contemplating which of them looked the tastiest, and one of them just sighed and said, "I'm too skinny, boys. You just get a mouthful of gristle." That's the secret. That's the thing we've forgotten. They knew that the body could endure almost anything if the ego remained intact. By making fun of their starvation, they kept it at a distance. They weren't dying of hunger. They were just having a particularly lean Tuesday. It's a subtle shift in perspective, but it's the difference between curling up and giving up and waking up the next morning to scrape another tree. And then, one day, the wind would change. The air would lose that sharp crystalline bite and start to smell like damp earth and rotting pine needles. The February thaw would arrive. To the mountain man, the first sight of a patch of bare ground was like seeing the gates of heaven. It meant the roots were coming back. It meant the hibernating animals were waking up. It meant they had survived another round in the ring with the mountains. They'd emerge from their holes, blinking in the unaccustomed brightness, looking like skeletal ghosts in tattered, greasy leather. They'd lost 30 pounds. Their hair was a bird's nest of pine resin and soot, and they probably smelled like a wet dog that had been rolled in a campfire. But they were alive, and in their world, that was the only metric of success that mattered. The mountain is quiet again. The hunger is just a memory. As you drift off, think about that resilience. Think about the fact that the human spirit is a lot tougher than we give it credit. You have everything you need. You are warm, you are fed, and you are safe. The shadows on your wall are long and soft, moving with the slow breath of the house. Let the weight of the history settle over you like a thick buffalo robe. You don't have to hunt, you don't have to trap, and you certainly don't have to eat your shoes. You can just be. Sleep is the ultimate rendezvous. It's the place where the cold can't follow and the silence is finally peaceful.
The gruesome mastery of mountain medicine. Now that we've survived the hunger and the snow holes, we have to look at the reality of what happened when the environment didn't just try to freeze you, but actually tried to break you. In a world without doctors, pharmacies, or even a clean bandage, the mountain man had to become his own surgeon, dentist, and pharmacist. And because they were who they were, their approach to medicine was, predictably, blunt, occasionally horrifying, and strangely effective. It's one thing to deal with a cold, it's another to deal with a shattered leg or a festering wound 300 miles from the nearest outpost. Let's float into the world of frontier cures, where the line between healing and torture was thinner than a piece of worn buckskin. The anatomy of the iron will. The most famous story in the annals of mountain medicine is, of course, that of Hugh Glass. You've probably seen the movies, but the reality was much more Sleepless Historian in its grim absurdity. After being mauled by a grizzly bear, an experience he described with a classic lack of hyperbole, he was left for dead. His leg was broken, his ribs were exposed, and he had festering wounds on his back. What did he do? He didn't have a trauma kit. He had a sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He understood that infection was the real killer. To stop the rot, he crawled to a downed log and allowed maggots to eat the dead, necrotic flesh from his wounds. It's disgusting, yes, but it's also brilliant. Maggots only eat the dead stuff. They leave the healthy tissue alone. It was a biological cleaning service. He stayed there, listening to the flies buzz and the wind whistle, watching nature's smallest surgeons work on his back. He didn't have painkillers, he just had the silence. Eventually, he dragged his shattered body 200 miles back to safety. It's the ultimate example of the mountain man ethos. If you can't fix it with a bandage, fix it with patience and a total disregard for your own comfort. The blacksmith as a dentist. Then there were the teeth. If you think a root canal is bad today, imagine having a tooth infection in the middle of the Wind River Range in 1832. There was no Novocaine, there was just a pair of rusty bullet molds or a set of pliers and a very large amount of high-proof whiskey. The procedure was simple. You drank until the world started to go blurry, and then you had your friend, the one with the steadiest hands, grip the offending tooth and pull until something gave way. Usually it was the tooth. Sometimes it was a piece of the jaw. They called it getting the iron. The irony, of course, is that after the screaming stopped, they'd just go right back to chewing on that dried buffalo jerky, which is basically the texture of a tractor tire. They didn't have time for a soft food diet. They just had to hope the whiskey killed the bacteria before it killed their liver. It was a brutal, binary way to live. You were either functional or you were dead. There was no in-between. The pharmacy of the forest. When they weren't pulling teeth or hosting maggots, they were looking to the plants. They were the accidental ethnobotanists of the West. They learned from the Shoshone, the Crow, and the Blackfeet that the wilderness was actually a giant green medicine cabinet. If you had a fever, you chewed on willow bark. They didn't know it contained salicin, which is the precursor to modern aspirin. They just knew that if you chewed the bitter stuff, your head stopped throbbing. It was a chemistry experiment where the lab was a frozen riverbank and the test subject was a guy who hadn't showered since 1829. For open wounds, they used pine pitch, the sticky sap that oozes from a wounded tree. It's a natural antiseptic and an airtight sealant.
They would smear the hot, sticky resin over a cut, essentially gluing themselves back together. It worked remarkably well, though removing it later was an experience that probably added a few more gray hairs to their beards. It's a recurring theme in their lives. The cure was often just as painful as the injury, but since they were already miserable, what was a little more stings between friends? The psychology of pain. The most fascinating part of mountain medicine isn't the tools, it's the mindset. We live in a culture that views pain as an emergency. For the mountain man, pain was just background noise. It was a constant companion, like the smell of wood smoke or the sound of the pack horses. They developed a level of mental callousing that we can't even comprehend. They didn't have the luxury of recovering. If you broke an arm, you set it yourself, tied it in a sling made of a tattered shirt, and kept checking your traps. You didn't get a week off. The mountain didn't care about your sick leave. This stoicism gave them a strange kind of peace. When you accept that you are going to be in some level of physical discomfort for the rest of your life, the fear of pain vanishes. You stop tensing up against it. You just let it flow through you. They were the accidental masters of mindfulness, though they would have probably punched anyone who used that word to describe them. They called it having grit, which is a much more mountain man-approved term. The gentle dissolve. So, as you're tucked into your bed, think about the incredible durability of the human frame. Think about those men sitting by their tiny fires, repairing their bodies with pine sap and willow bark, and then waking up the next day to walk another 20 miles through the snow. You don't have to be that tough tonight. You don't have to fix anything. Your body knows exactly what to do. As you breathe in and out, your cells are repairing themselves, your mind is sorting through the day, and your nervous system is finally standing down. The great silence is here for you now. It's not the silence of a lonely cabin, it's the silence of a safe room. The wind is just a soft hum in the distance. The shadows are soft like the fur of a buffalo robe. Your grit isn't needed here. You can be soft. You can be still. The traps are checked, the willow bark tea is finished, and the mountain is asleep. It's time for you to do the same. Just let the history fade into a blur of gray and white, and let yourself sink into the deep, warm marrow of sleep.
The chaos of the rendezvous. We've spent a lot of time in the quiet, freezing dark. We've talked about the loneliness, the eating of shoes, and the maggots acting as surgeons. But now, the sun has finally climbed high enough to melt the ice on the Green River. The birds are back, the grass is lush, and the mountain man, looking like a skeletal, bearded ghost, is ready for the one thing that kept him sane all winter, the rendezvous. If the winter was a test of endurance, the rendezvous was a masterclass in how much chaos a human being can generate in a single week. Imagine a medieval fair, a business convention, and a heavy metal festival all collided in a remote mountain valley. It was the only time of year these solitary men saw other people, and they made sure it counted. Because when you've spent 6 months talking to a mule, you have a lot of social energy to burn off. The economy of excess. The rendezvous was technically a business meeting. The big fur companies would bring in wagon trains full of supplies, whiskey, gunpowder, lead, tobacco, and coffee to trade for the brown gold the trappers had collected. But business is a very loose term here. A mountain man might walk into the valley with a year's worth of beaver pelts, a small fortune in 1830, and within 48 hours he have absolutely nothing left but a massive headache and a new set of stories. They'd trade a pile of furs for a gallon of Passkey whiskey, which was basically grain alcohol mixed with tobacco juice and red pepper for kick. They'd buy overpriced silk ribbons for their indigenous wives, or perhaps a new rifle they didn't really need. There was a beautiful, snarky nihilism to it. They knew they might not survive the next winter, so why save money? Why have a retirement plan when your retirement plan is likely a grizzly bear or a flash flood? They lived in the absolute present.
They'd spend $1,000 in an afternoon and then head back into the wild with nothing but a bag of flour and a fresh supply of salt. It was the ultimate treat yourself, but with much more buckskin. The Olympics of the wild. Once the trading was done, the games began. These weren't organized sports. They were displays of ego and survival skills, fueled by that pepper-infused whiskey. There were horse races that usually ended in a spectacular pileup, and shooting matches where men would try to bark a squirrel, shooting the tree bark just below the animal so the vibration would kill it without damaging the meat. Then there was wrestling. Mountain man wrestling wasn't about points or referees. It was a sweaty, grunting test of who was more stubborn. They'd roll around in the dust, laughing and cursing, until one of them simply couldn't move anymore. And yet, despite the violence and the noise, there was a strange, unspoken brotherhood. These men were the only people on Earth who understood what it was like to be at the top of a pass in a blizzard. They were a tribe of outcasts. They'd fight each other for fun, but they'd die for each other without a second thought. It was a community built on shared misery and a mutual love for a life that most people would find terrifying. The Great Fade Out. As the week drew to a close, the valley would change. The whiskey barrels would run dry. The laughter would get quieter. The wagon trains would start their slow trek back to civilization, a place the mountain men viewed with deep suspicion and a bit of pity. One by one, the trappers would pack their new supplies onto their horses. They'd shake hands, maybe share one last pipe of tobacco, and then simply vanish back into the trees. They were heading back to the silence. And the weird thing is, they were happy about it. The noise was fun, but the mountain was home. They understood that you need the chaos to appreciate the quiet, and you need the quiet to survive the chaos. It's a balance, a very loud, very dusty balance. The final fade out. As we finish our journey tonight, I want you to imagine that valley as the sun sets. The smoke from the last few campfires is drifting up toward the stars. The noise of the horses and the shouting is fading away, replaced by the sound of the river. You are one of those men. You've had your fun, you've told your stories, and now you're heading back into the high country. You have your blankets, your fire starter, and the vast, cool evening ahead of you. The world is huge, and you are small, and that is exactly how it should be. There are no deadlines here. There are no bills. There's just the rhythm of your horse's hooves and the smell of the pines. You are moving to the deepest sleep of the year, the sleep of a man who has nothing left to prove. Let the air get cooler. Let the blankets feel heavier. The rendezvous is over, and the great silence is welcoming you back. You are safe. You are drifting. You are gone.